the Clinton administration, and recently he served as the director of National Economic Council under President Obama. But more than everything, Professor Summers is well known to be a big fan of controversy and someone whose mind is sharp and his words are even sharper, and I'm particularly delighted, therefore, to have you with us.
Glad to be here.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems that despite the personal price that you have paid for the way you formulate your statements, you still believe in the power of provocation?
I do. I believe that much of what goes wrong in the world goes wrong because of unchallenged assumptions and unwarranted presumptions.
That's why you challenge the assumption that women can be as good scientists as men.
Not quite. That's not what I said. What I did do was raise the question of whether there were different judgments that people made about what they wanted to do, and that had some part of the pattern that we observed, and that the easy assumption that all differences that we observe between different groups reflect discrimination may not be the right assumption. Obviously, we all want to see a maximum of opportunity for everyone in every field, and that was what my remarks that day, if you actually read them, were directed at. But if we're going to think right about any question, we have to be open to all possible hypotheses. And it seems to me that the greatest danger lies in those who are prepared to reject the idea of argument and the idea of evidence and the idea of argument that can get to a closer approximation to truth. There's no shame in being wrong. There is shame in being unwilling to consider one's ideas and test those ideas against other possibilities.
And people would rather call you a provocator than really challenge basic assumptions.
You know, I'll leave it to others to use the language they want with respect to me. I do believe whether the question is understanding patterns that arise in a university, whether the question is thinking about what the right biological theory is, whether the question is what kind of policy response is appropriate to a banking crisis, whether the question is what types of strategies will be availing with respect to the development of the Middle East. It seems to me you have to, as Keynes said, study the past in light of the present with a view to the future.
And he also
you have to be able to, you have to be willing to look at any possibility and be prepared to challenge the assumptions under which you're operating. It's not always comfortable, but it is the way forward.
There's another quote of Keynes that you like to bring about, and that's when he said that when circumstances change, I change my opinion. Did you change to your opinion regarding deregulation and the role of government in the economic sphere after you were part or a central part of deregulation in the 90s, and nowadays you're the first one to admit that America is closing a lost economic decade? Were you wrong?
You know, there's a certain style of question which is like, when did you stop beating your grandmother? Where
we ask it about your wife.
Where there's no answer that you can give that's availing. Look, I think this isn't the place to debate it in detail. I think a great deal of what is said about economic policy in the 1990s and the attitudes taken in the 1990s is not accurate. So I don't accept a great deal of what is said. Having said that, I don't think any thinking person can come through the experience of the financial crisis that we just suffered without re-examining their assumptions about how the financial system operates, and without coming to more skepticism than they had before about the workings of unchecked markets, and that we need new approaches within businesses in terms of the broad provision of information, in terms of the restrictions that are placed on what financial institutions can do, in terms of the capacities that governments develop to respond to crises. I don't see how you can live through the last 5 years without being prepared to adjust your views with respect to that. We've passed a major financial reform law in the United States. It's got a variety of compromises. It's not exactly the one that I would have chosen, but would I wish that it had been passed in the 1990s? Of course I would wish that it had been passed in the 1990s. But I think that one does have to be fair to those who participate in public debates, and to say, as I just said, I hope fairly clearly, that I felt I had learned a lot from the events of the last 5 years is not to grant legitimacy to any caricature that may be offered with respect to the views that I or others had during the 1990s.
I think you gave a fair answer to a not very fair question.
Thank you.
But I want to go
But
beyond.
you'll follow up with another unfair question till you can find one to which I don't give a good answer.
If I were paid for this, I would tell you that that's what I get paid for, but I do it voluntarily. So I guess the bigger question and the most interesting one is beyond economics. Are we witnessing the decline of the American empire? Will the American economy bounce back? But it's more than that. Will America be what it has been for 100 years now, or 200?
I believe so. I have always been an optimist about the United States. Churchill captured a certain truth when he said the United States always does the right thing, but often after exhausting the alternatives. We benefit, I think, from a resilience as a society that is, I think, something very powerful. We are able to welcome immigrants in a scale that is unmatched among large countries around the world. We have a capacity to nurture and to create an environment where things like Google and Facebook can happen, where a kid can go from living in a dorm room hoping not to be suspended from Harvard to running a company worth tens of billions of dollars that touches the lives of 700 million people for an average of a half an hour a day.
And redefines politics.
Inside of 5 years. That capacity that exists in the United States is, I think, a remarkable strength. It's a strength that comes from the willingness and desire of people to come to our universities, to understand our institutions, to participate in our capital markets. Now, to be sure, Our economy faces large challenges. If too many Americans decide that our government cannot work, that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But I believe that if you study our history, what I think you have to be struck by is that in 1960, in the early 1960s, John Kennedy believed that Russia would surpass the United States economically by 1985. In the early mid-1970s, Henry Kissinger crafted the détente strategy because he thought the trend of history was in important respects running against the United States. In 1991, every issue of the Harvard Business Review declared that the Cold War was over and Germany and Japan had won. We are a country that is prone to alarm about our future, but it is precisely because we are prone to alarm about our future and to response to that alarm that I believe we will remake our future for the next generation. I believe in the list of sins that complacency is a more besetting sin than is usually recognized, that does more damage to nations, to companies, to institutions, to individuals. And it is the fact that America is the country, probably the only country in the world that can produce the set of remarkable individuals, some I like better than others, but the set of remarkable individuals from really remarkable backgrounds, if you think about it, who become our president. And that is a profound antidote to the complacency that is such a threat to the future of nations.
And with two of those individuals you had the privilege to work, I want to ask you about the last one, about President Barack Obama. Yes, he can? Can
Yes,
he stand up to the occasion? Can he fulfill the endless expectations? Can anybody stand up to such really ambitious aspirations?
Yes, he can, and in important respects, yes, he has. You know, we didn't talk about it this way at the time, but in December of 2008, the stock market was falling faster than it did in the first 6 months of the Depression. Jobs were being lost faster than they ever had been since the data were collected. International trade was collapsing to the point where freight rates were 12% of what they had been. Most people thought the financial system was going to collapse, and the relevant parallels were to the Great Depression. I don't minimize the pain and the distress in the United States and the global economy today, but I can tell you that without Barack Obama's leadership, it could have been much worse. I can tell you something else I can tell you two other things that he has accomplished. We take it for granted in the United States today that any senior citizen has access to medical care. That was declared to be socialism when it was brought into place in 1965. I have no doubt that a quarter century from now, people will wonder how it could ever have been that in a rich country like the United States, people didn't all have access to health care. That's been the dream, the unfinished part of an agenda of social decency for a century. And Barack Obama got that done even as he was wrestling with the Depression. There are a million questions that can be asked, and probably 900